Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. If you ask someone about philosophy of history, they're likely to think that you're talking about something dry and obscure and academic. Or perhaps they would know the phrase by philosopher George Santayana that those who cannot remember history are condemned to repeat it. Or perhaps Mark Twain's famous observation that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. In fact, this week's guest on Horns of a Dilemma argues in his article in Volume 5, Issue 3 of Texas National Security Review that everyone has a philosophy of history. Each of us takes the events that we've experienced, the events that we've learned, and places them into a context that carefully selects which events have meaning, how it is that we order them, how it is that we assign that meaning, and those help to shape our view of ourselves in the nation as well as our nation's place in the world. Andrew Ehrhardt explores in his article, Everyman His Own Philosopher of History, Notions of Historical Process in the Study and Practice of Foreign Policy, just exactly how that process works, not only in the minds of philosophers and policymakers, but also in the minds of everyday people who are voters. Andrew is kind enough to join us today on the podcast. And Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Doyle. I'm Andrew Ehrhardt. I'm an Ernest May Fellow in History and Policy at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School. Delighted to be here, so thanks for the opportunity.
Excellent. I really appreciate you joining us. Can you outline for us basically what the argument of your article is?
Absolutely. So the article says a good number of things, perhaps too many, but I think there's three overarching points. So the first is kind of outlining what is meant by the philosophy of history. And then as you say, or as you mentioned, and then as the title suggests, is that everybody has either consciously or unconsciously some notion of historical processes or the way in which history unfolds. And that's really what I mean by philosophy of history here. So that's the first point. Second is really a warning against robust and grand philosophies of history. So we should be wary of large generalizations, laws, or patterns that scholars attempt to discern over time. And here I kind of bring in certain methodologies or approaches related to what is called historicism. So this is a way of kind of pushing back against large philosophies of history. The third is that the philosophy of history is important to considerations of grand strategy, or what we might call high policy. So foreign policy decisions at the very highest level. So these tend to come down, or at least tend to concern themselves with where we have been, where we are, where we're going, recognizing some of the key forces or undercurrents of history and how these have infinite variety across populations. And then finally, as a part of that third point, is the role of individuals and societies in being able to shape and shift the present moment.
This is really fascinating to me, and in part that's because, well, I'm a nerd. But if I take someone who is working in a field not related to history, not related to politics, your article argues that this has meaning for them too. Why?
Absolutely. So, and I love this question as well, because it's so important to take these kind of scholarly or intellectual, if you will, studies and discussions, and then bring them down into kind of practical issues, right? So why in the world would anybody really care about this? History is boring, philosophy is difficult, and it's also divorced from the real world, some might say. So why in the world would we want to combine both of these things into something called the philosophy of history? But I think the philosophy of history, and here I'm speaking about ideas related to But I think the philosophy of history, and here I'm speaking about ideas related to the way in which history unfolds, are all around us. So everyone from auto mechanics to teachers, to doctors, to cashiers, to academics, to politicians do this. And I think it happens consciously at times, but especially unconsciously. So for a lot of Americans of a certain generation, the story is one of inevitable progress and the idea that this will keep going in perpetuity. Others see history, or they see their societies, as in decline. Others see it as moving in cycles. Now, if you're an auto mechanic and you believe that there are historical cycles related to economic depressions or violent revolutions or wars between states, then this can affect your future decision-making. Now, it might not be the biggest factor in your decision making, but I argue that it is there, and it's a powerful undercurrent in your own political thought. I mean, we see this in other cases too. So you hear kind of certain sayings as God has a plan for us, right? So again, it's a powerful force in one's mind. If I can just discover what God wants, then I will somehow achieve happiness. And this is something that we hear quite a bit from different folks. So this is a profound mental construct, I would say, and it affects daily decision-making, especially on a moral level. And then finally, just another way of looking at this, especially kind of on an individual level, and for the everyday or every man, every woman type consideration, we can think of what might be called determinism, right? So if you are against determinism, the idea that history has some end for you, you might say that I can achieve whatever I want to achieve and nothing can stop me. And that's fine. Others, though, may believe that a society or class that they're born into has resigned them to a certain existence and experience, one that they must adapt to or be forever unhappy. Right? So there's a lot of different ways that people, I think, in my opinion, can relate to this.
Yeah, and if any of our listeners have seen the show Hamilton, I'm reminded of that wonderful refrain of history has its eyes on you. And this betrays a particular view both of what is history and what an individual's place in it might be. But I wanted to take a quick detour because I want to clarify that when we're talking about philosophy of history and how different philosophies of history affect your perspective, we're not necessarily talking about the accuracy of the story. We're not talking about whether they got their facts straight so much as we were talking about which facts they choose to assign meaning to and what type of meaning they assign. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So I think that's part of it, right? So when we talk about philosophy of history, we're obviously talking about historians and philosophers and other thinkers and writers who've engaged with this idea that history has a purpose, a direction, it's going somewhere, right? It has meaning. So if we look at certain historical approaches, if you will, or even historical schools, we can think of the Annalist school, which grew up and came out of France in the 20th century. And they took really long views of history. And the idea there was trying to identify certain quiet undercurrents that normal historians or historians coming before them may not have identified as the prime movers, whether that might be climate, environment, any sort of like really long-term forces, right? So a certain philosophy of history and one's approach to the study of history can say a great deal about what are the forces or the influences that a historian actually thinks are important. Absolutely. But I'm not sure that every historian necessarily needs to have a philosophy of history in order to then begin defining what they think is important, right? So I think that's kind of an important clarification there.
So I'm also curious because you point out in the article how nations appear to have a philosophy of history as well. And I realize there's some risk in assigning this sort of perspective to a collective institution, but you mentioned the example of the United States. France comes to mind as well. I think a good deal of the friction between the United States and France stems from the fact that France's view of its place in history is very similar to the U.S.'s view of its own place in history. So I'm curious how you feel like this philosophy of history really affects how nations behave, how they act in the world.
I think it has a great deal to do with it, really, in terms of those big questions about place in the world, purpose of your place in the world, purpose of foreign policy, right? So I think these are ones that people, they're really massive questions, so people might not engage with them on a daily basis, but I think it is a very, very important force within one's political thought, moral thought, but especially international thought, right? So if you look at the United States, and again, you really have to be careful about, again, generalizing across this big of a society, but especially across time. But there has been a movement, I think, in American history, and it's identifiable at different stages, with this idea of progress, right? A kind of linear upwards trajectory over time. And there might be points of decline or regress, but overall we're moving towards something. We're moving towards the light, if you will. And you hear this even in the founding documents, right? The Declaration of Independence talks about the divine hand of providence, if you will. It comes out in speeches. And if you look at, I think, a number of American presidents and their speeches, State of the Union to other well-known moments, some of these characteristics about the United States is the vanguard of progress, or it is moving in a certain direction towards liberty or towards the truth, if you will, does shine through, right? And I think a fundamental point is that these are usually more mythical than they are realistic or kind of embodied in some truth, right? And I think other nations have variances of this. So France, you mentioned, but a classic example is the French Enlightenment in the 18th century, right? And what this meant and kind of the movement of reason, the movement of modernity, the movement of science in terms of what this meant for the future, but also society as well as human existence, right? So it's this idea of being at the vanguard of progress. And then another theme in the paper is historicism, which really grows up in the German context as a intellectual revolt against the French Enlightenment, right? The idea that not all societies develop according to these same principles, right? To these same laws of development. And I think I'll add one more thing, and that's you see it in the present day as well. So I do not pretend to be a scholar of Russian history or Russian culture. And I think if you want to look to folks who really, really know something about this, Fiona Hill comes to mind, Sergei Radchenko, Steve Kotkin, who can kind of speak to this, among many others. But there is, I think, something that's recognizable in Russian history, Russian literature especially, is a kind of fatalism or determinism where individuals, or at least some individuals within society or certain groups within society kind of resign themselves to the inevitable. And this has a profound effect on how they think about larger concepts like liberty or freedom or individuality, for instance.
And I think it also tends to influence a conception of place, about what the appropriate role or place for a state or society in the international order of things is. And I think, again, you see that very clearly in the example of Russia with Putin's desire to be taken seriously as a great power. I think arguably it plays a role in the case of China with their quote-unquote historical claims to areas of the South China Sea that seek to recapitalize on and perhaps emphasize an era in which China played a much different role than it played over the last 70 years. So yeah, it's fascinating the degree to which this shared identity that no one has ever experienced can profoundly shape their notion of what's right and what's wrong.
The whole notion of world order to some is premised, I think, on a theory of history, right? The idea that the entire world, that humanity, much less the international system, is moving in a certain direction or needs to move in a certain direction, right? So my supervisor, who I was incredibly lucky to study with, is John Bew. And one of the points that he's made actually in the Texas National Security Review, I think for the first issue, was that world order is kind of an aspirational vision, but especially goal, particularly within Western societies, right? So this whole idea and conception and perception of world order, international order, I think could benefit from an interrogation of how much theories of history go into these ideas of order.
So you talked a little bit about historicism arising in Germany as a response to the Enlightenment, but in your article, you also talk about the role of historicism in American foreign policy. And I'm wondering if you can discuss how historicism manifests in the American context.
One big thing to lay out is that I think historicism is a difficult term to define precisely because there have been so many different interpretations of it. All right, so the great I think, American understanding of historicism, at least in the second half of the 20th century, came from the philosopher Karl Popper, right? And what he was arguing against were essentially what historicists are arguing against, which is against large generalizations and laws about the way in which history unfolds, right? So their idea that there is one answer or set of answers to explain, this in human existence, if you will. Now, Popper, in arguing against historicism, is actually arguing for what I would say is the more traditional but also useful form of historicism, right? So the idea of breaking down large patterns, generalizations, narratives of history. So in the American context, I think we have to be very careful, and we have to start out with what exactly we mean when we talk about historicism. So within the U.S. context, I think historicism is also been somewhat of a dangerous term, and people don't necessarily want to associate with historicism because people tie it or try to tie it back to, because people will try to relate it back to its origins in Germany in the 19th century, and then draw a straight line from German thinkers in the 19th century about how Germany should develop according to its own laws and traditions and customs, and then draw a straight line to National Socialism in the first half of the 20th century, right? So there is this idea that historicism, if you take it from a methodology into a worldview, is incredibly nefarious, right? So I think that's something that we have to push back on. And then really the point of the article as well was to say that I don't think there's enough approaches related to historicism that factor into the study and practice of American foreign policy. So what I was trying to do in many ways was inject just a small but healthy dose of historicism into the discussion.
I'm curious because, especially when you raise the example of Germany in the first part of the 20th century, as we've raised the example of Vladimir Putin, it is hard to avoid this idea of abuses or misuses of history. And so it could be easy for a listener or a reader to come away and think, man, philosophy of history is doing more harm than it's doing good. It gives people this idea of place. It can lend itself to these sorts of xenophobic and exclusionary ideologies. And so it's problematic. But is there an alternative? I mean, don't all states have a philosophy of history to some extent? Or are there states that can proceed without that?
I think some states and some societies might have a more recognizable philosophy of history. I certainly can't speak to the philosophies of history held by different societies. I think it's infinitely complex and infinitely numerous as well, right? But I do think that, and this is an important point, and this is really something I'm wrestling with at the moment, is just how much of our knowledge of what we consider moral, of what we consider ethical, really historically conditioned, right? And that's a very, very big subject, and it's one that philosophers and to a lesser extent historians have grappled with for centuries, right? Where do we, or how do we arrive at certain ethical and moral stances, right? Are these truths handed down, at least in the West, from Greek and Roman antiquity? Or is it something that's developed over time? And it's kind of a layered history, and we've arrived at certain historical conventions, you might say, right? So these are fundamental, and I think a huge, huge danger in the historicist approach, especially if you adopt it as what I call kind of a full-blown worldview, which some have adopted, is you arrive at what is called relativism, so ethical and moral relativism, which is that no one really knows. No individual or society really knows what is right. So if you have in your society the idea of honor killings, for instance, who really is to say that that's wrong, right? And I think that can be incredibly dangerous. And so how do you arrive at and how do you avoid the descent into boundless relativism, as this Dutch historian Peter Gale called it. And this is something that famous historicists throughout history, from Friedrich Meinecke to Ernest Troeltsch, I'm probably mispronouncing his last name, but they grappled with this dilemma of historicism for their entire lives, and they weren't really able to arrive at something satisfactory, at least for their liking. But I think there are some interpretations, and especially if you don't take a radical historicist view, to where you can avoid the pit of relativism, if you will. And I think a great thinker who taps into this, among a few others, is Isaiah Berlin. Right, so he was someone that cannot be defined as a historicist, but my goodness, was he interested in it. And he looked to Friedrich Meinecke as someone who was incredibly important within Western thought, Western political thought. But Berlin was someone who supported, and I think over time advocated for, pluralist societies, right? The notions of liberties, but especially the negative conceptions of liberty and what this could do for what he thought would be a pluralist society, where you can have different interpretations of what it is to lead a good life, right, within a society, but also across societies. And then, provided that people were developing according to their own kind of universal values, provided they were doing that peacefully, then they could exist together, right? And so that's a very, very simplified way of saying it, but I do think that that's one way that we can avoid a danger of radical historicism, which is the pitfalls of radical relativism.
So I would just point out that if you're engaged with someone who was struggling with the problem of relativism, that there shouldn't be an improper way to pronounce their name. It's all relative. But you also invoke Alistair MacIntyre in addressing this issue, and you quote him to the effect that if two opposing schools are grappling over something, they must have a point of agreement from which to grapple. But you seem a little bit skeptical of that in the article. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, so that's the first I'd come across MacIntyre in that sense. So I think he's one that's trying to wrestle with this, right, and trying to find a way to escape the trap of relativism. And I think it's a fair point, but it's also one that I don't really buy. The one that I buy is by Thomas Haskell. He was, as I was researching this issue, and myself trying to figure out how to avoid a radical historicist or relativist position, I came across Haskell's work, which talks about the importance of historical conventions, right? So if you have two competing schools or ethical systems, let's say, moral systems, he goes a step further than MacIntyre and says that, the competition between them might be pretty difficult for a long stretch of time, but at some point they can arrive at a common basis, right? And I think Haskell has a lot in common with some of the topics that Berlin was discussing in terms of how do we arrive at a more pluralist domestic society, but even international society.
And of course, this question of competing opposing viewpoints coming to a conclusion that melds both portions brings to mind Hegel. And you engage as well with this Hegelian view, and especially as it was embodied in Francis Fukuyama and his arguments about the last man and the end of history.
Absolutely. And I think Fukuyama's book there is incredibly important. And I think, as I mentioned in the article, it's one that doesn't get enough credit. I think people read the title and then maybe some of the interpretations and then completely write it off. But it's a rich idea. I think it's incredibly learned, but it's also one that I kind of fundamentally disagree with, because if you read kind of the last pages of that great work, he is kind of talking about wagons. I remember this analogy of wagons moving in a certain direction, and while they might not be going in the exact same direction, they're kind of moving along this trajectory, right? And I think that is one that gripped the West, right? Gripped the United States in particular after the Cold War. You can see that in the 1990s and even the 2000s. I do think it's a bit dangerous, right? Especially when people are misinterpreting the nuances of some of Fukuyama's argument. So he argued when And when you get to the end of history, it's not exactly easy living. But nonetheless, I think the idea that moving in a certain direction towards liberalism, towards free market economies, towards technology having some sort of deterministic influence over the direction of societies, at least from social, economic, and political stances, I think was incorrect, and also had a negative effect on larger ideas of foreign policy, right? Of America's place in the world, America's purpose as an international actor. So we have to be very careful about this.
I think the influence of a philosophy of history on American foreign policy is pretty clear. You think of a concept like manifest destiny, again, which you mentioned in the article, and this clearly has a sense, which you've traced, of the idea that America is a nation endowed with some type of special purpose, some type of divine providence, some type of mission. It strikes me, though, that especially today, what we've just been talking about in terms of competing views of history and relative weights is an extraordinarily powerful descriptor of the American domestic political scene as well, especially as it results to security questions. And we take a look at questions such as those surrounding the teaching of critical race theory, those surrounding the dishonoring of Confederate figures and removal of their monuments, these sorts of things. Is this another example of philosophy of history come to life in American society?
I think you can see this all over domestic American society. And this is coming from someone who is not as serious an observer and student of American domestic politics, but even just reading the newspapers, a little bit of social media before it drives me crazy. You can see a lot of notions related to theories of history about where we have been, but especially where we're going throughout all of these issues that you mentioned: critical race theory, monuments that were dedicated to Confederate generals, and so on. I think a huge one that sometimes we overlook is the trope "Make America Great Again." Right? This is so just from a kind of scholar's perspective, just an unbelievable and kind of profound statement, right? In terms of when you break that down, what does that actually mean, right? Because if you want to make it great again, well, obviously there's been a decline, and there's been regress, and there's been some tough moments. But what about before then, right? And can we get back there, right? So a lot of this stuff is evident in even tropes where I think the ones who came up with that saying, for instance, weren't exactly totally conscious of that being a theory of history, let's say. And then more recently, I think, and this is something I came across as I was writing the article, and this is around 2020 and 2021. But in the aftermath of the pandemic, there's so many folks who were talking about the acceleration of history. And I remember there being, I think, on the website Foreign Policy, a slew of scholars who were American international relations scholars and historians, all of them incredibly well-known, great bodies of work and so forth. But so many of them were talking about this idea of history speeding up, of all these things that were going to be inevitable anyways, now speeding up, right? Whether that might have been working from home or decoupling on a massive economic scale, advancements in AI and so forth, right? And then when you hear these kind of lines, the acceleration of history, I think it has a really, really important effect on the way that people are viewing the present, but also the future, right? I mean, the future is incredibly uncertain, but at the same time, we're trying to make sense of it constantly. And the only thing you have to go off of is historical experience, historical study, right? And what you do with historical facts. But when something like the acceleration of history comes out, I think we really have to interrogate that, right? And I think that's what I was hoping, amongst other things, to push back on, these kind of simplistic notions of the way that history is moving, in the direction of history, if there is one.
So, it also strikes me that there's been a really, from my perspective, salutary movement within political science to use history in a more conscious way, in a more disciplined way. And I think Neustadt and May, maybe began that with Thinking in Time. You move to Hong's Analogies at War, and this question of how it is that you frame situations in seeking to find patterns that may or may not be repeating. Isn't this also just an exercise in philosophy of history?
Yeah, so I think that's an important question. And it's probably the right time to say that the entire reason I got interested in this subject really was a conversation with my supervisor, who I mentioned, John Bew. But we were talking about applied history, and we were both kind of a part of this new applied history movement, which is really taking its cues from the great Ernest May, who was a professor at Harvard for years. And this idea that history could be relevant to contemporary discussions, especially around politics, around international politics. And so we agreed with that. We think applied history is absolutely, or at least using history in this way, is absolutely fundamental, right, from a practical perspective. But then I started thinking, well, what about a philosophic perspective, right? Let's really interrogate and try to discover just how useful history is, right? And so I think when we talk about the approaches of historians to political scientists, it's always a discussion that me as a postdoc I'm having with loads of my colleagues here at the Belfer Center, many of whom are great political scientists, international relations theorists. But one of the things that I argue in general, but especially in this article, is that we need to be wary at times of developing too robust, too rigid categorizations, but also predictions of politics, right? So especially on the international level, especially when it comes to issues between or within, but also between societies. In terms of these folks like Hong and Neustadt and May having philosophies of history, and this is probably more the direct answer to your question, because they haven't laid out their own philosophy of history, and here I'm talking about speculative philosophy of history as opposed to analytical. Speculative is the ideas related to directions or movements of history. Because they haven't laid out specifically what their speculative philosophy of history might be, we can't really discern it, right? I think you might be able to try to read it in all of their writings if you take their body of writings, but a lot of people don't engage with this on an explicit and direct level, and that's okay, right? Now, on an analytical level, in terms of analytical philosophy of history, then we certainly can. And so the article at the very beginning says we're not getting into the analytical philosophy of history, but it does wade into certain discussions. And those discussions have to do with what constitutes a historical fact, but also how you gather, arrange, interpret, and make sense of historical facts, right? And so I think international relations theorists, political scientists, they are constantly arranging and gathering historical facts and then analyzing them according to certain methodologies or interpretations, and that's fine. Historians do the same thing, but I think they do it and probably should do it at not, let's say, as intense a level, right? And in that sense, you are tapping into certain issues related to the philosophy of history, but as opposed to the speculative side, it's more the analytical side.
Yeah, one of the other examples you raise in the article, which I think is a fascinating one, is Graham Allison's famous argument about the Thucydides trap. And, I think this is another one where there's a strong argument that there are analytical issues with his use of Thucydides as anything other than a metaphor in this case. But it also is fascinating because the time frame in which you look matters a great deal as well. I mean, there's a pretty plausible argument that the winner of the Peloponnesian War were the Persians. And that if that's the lesson that you choose to take from it, that's a very different lesson than the one that Allison took and used as the hook for his analysis of the U.S. Sino competition.
Absolutely. So I should start by saying that Graham Allison is someone who runs the Ernest May program here at Harvard in the Applied History project. He's been incredibly good to me and a mentor in many ways. But I disagree with his take on the idea of the Thucydides trap. And I suggest very subtly within the article that, in fact, it's something that I would disagree with based on some of his methods, which, broadly speaking, and kind of very obviously, take very large generalizations and patterns that he discerns over time, and in this case, over millennia, to say something about how great powers interact. And I think that just need to chip away a little bit at that in order to begin looking at the historical detail, if we will, and the details about these powers and about these societies and their own philosophic systems, their own intellectualisms, their own political philosophy, in order to arrive at, knowledge that'll help us with policy decisions, right? So it's kind of in this article, and like the very big objective, if you will, the overarching objective is to chip away at some of these larger theories about international politics.
Yeah, and there's an interesting element there that I think comes to fore in Allison's analysis is also the role of technology on that, because for example, if 12 of 16 cases have one outcome, but the 4 that have a different outcome are all clustered post-1945, it's worth asking if there were any technological developments in 1945 that changed the way in which great powers compete. And so, it's an interesting question.
So it's an interesting point. And just to say very quickly, it taps into something I've come across but hope to really sink my teeth into at some point, is this idea of technological determinism. So simply put, it's, if you have a certain technological development, does that mean that you'll see other developments or inevitable developments on a social or political level, right? It's the idea of the invention of the car, for instance, in automobiles. Does that mean we will see developments of suburbs, as you saw in the 1950s, for instance, right? We see kind of sprawl. And I think when we talk about technological determinism, I think when we talk about nuclear weapons, when we talk about systems or new systems of war, AI, and so forth, all of this stuff is way over my head at the moment. But these considerations are important, right? What does the development of a certain technology, mean for political interactions, right? Or even social interactions.
As we come up on the end of the podcast, it struck me that this is just a fascinating and systematic exploration of something that I think a lot of people feel intuitively, but haven't necessarily sat down and thought carefully about. And so if we were able to get you 20 minutes on the agenda at the next G8 summit, what would you ask these leaders to take away about history, the philosophy of history, and how it influences their choices in foreign policy?
I think I'd probably begin by apologizing to all those gathered at the G8 summit for having to listen to me for 20 minutes. And then I'd have my eye on the food and beverages, which I imagine would be pretty darn good. But more seriously, I would use the moment to perhaps suggest very subtly that those gathered not operate on the assumption that what is best for me is best for others, much less everyone. I think, if anything, a small but healthy dose of historicism might be useful here. And the idea is this: each society, we might even say each national society, is infinitely unique compared to other societies, and it develops, in many cases, in its own way. At times, some of these societies have their own notions of what is timeless or universal, and these are constructs that are made up of religious, intellectual, spiritual, or even moral forces. But there's a need, I think, to first recognize this as a scholar or a policy analyst, and then especially for policy analysts to craft recommendations on this basis, as opposed to assuming that all populations, whether they know it or not, desire some specific ethical or moral precept or even some sort of specific political institution. So I think if G8 leaders could recognize this and were possible accept this, then and especially accept or at least recognize what I see as kind of the infinite complexity and uniqueness of individual societies, then we might go some way towards crafting better policy decisions.
It's kind of fascinating because, one of the other things about history that I think betrays a philosophy of history that many people may be familiar with is Martin Luther King's statement that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And it sounds like what you're saying, and please don't let me put words in your mouth if I'm saying it wrong, is that it bends towards what we choose to have it bend toward. And if we want it to bend towards justice, that's a product of choices and efforts that we make.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked this question because it gets to a larger point, which I don't discuss in the article, but I think it's worth saying. So when you talk about arcs of history, I think, unfortunately, these are mythical notions, right, as opposed to anything that can be proven. But even though they're myths, it's really important that societies have myths, right? Now, it can be dangerous because you can have absolutely asinine myths. I think I mentioned the idea of honor killings in certain societies, or certain myths that Putin is talking about in terms of what Russia deserves in the international system. I think these are asinine and dangerous, right? But there are certain myths which can be healthy, I think, and they can act as a kind of animating spirit or animating force within societies, which policymakers, even those concerned with foreign policy, can and really should recognize and then operate on, right? So if you can kind of nudge myths in a certain direction very carefully and thoughtfully, I think it can be important. And it takes me back to the great historian William McNeill's argument that all historians are myth makers, right? Now, this is a very kind of philosophic argument, and we have to be careful lest certain factions within American domestic society who don't believe really anything that comes from the opposition, if they latch onto this, then the historical profession is screwed. But on an intellectual kind of academic basis, it is true, right? In terms of what history actually is, it's incredibly subjective because it's left up to the historian who, similar to a literary writer in many respects, is trying to grasp some perspective, some truth of the society or the moment or the event that they're investigating. And so I think that on a fundamental level, if historians can recognize that, if policymakers can recognize what historical narratives even mean, and they can recognize the power of myths within society, then that can be helpful. But, and this is the final point, the massive disclaimer is that better be very careful with it because it can be used in very dangerous ways.
Yeah, I love that. And it occurs to me, it's a little bit like cartography is, I can't draw a 1-to-1 scale map. I've got to choose what it is that I put on that is salient, that will communicate the point that matters, because I simply can't draw it all there. And the choices both of what's included and what's omitted are extraordinarily powerful in shaping how people get to where they're going or don't. So
absolutely.
We've been talking with Andrew Ehrhardt, who is the author of Everyman, His Own Philosopher of History, Notions of Historical Process in the Study and Practice of Foreign Policy. That appears in Volume 5, Issue 3 of Texas National Security Review. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Doyle, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.